Nothing could have prepared the state of Texas for the release of thousands of inmates, hundreds of murderers on death row, suddenly roaming the streets. This isn't the plot of a horror movie. This was an overcrowded system with no laws to permit the parole of monsters, no way to keep them locked up, and no way to watch over them once they were out. It was a free-for-all with one man in particular wreaking havoc over and over again, and even escaping death row. And definitely not because he was reformed. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about the Broomstick Killer who was actually freed to kill. I guarantee you this one will upset you so incredibly much, and it's issues that we face even today. But it is October. This is the last October video. I posted the strangest cases all month long, so if you would like to watch those, I will leave a playlist down below where you can get to know all of those cases. And I am so happy to have you guys along for this journey, and I'm just so grateful that you guys are here and that you support and that you truly care. It really does mean the world to me. And I also want to say it is almost Halloween, so happy Halloween, and please be safe out there. Make sure you're around people who you trust. And there is something that I wanted to bring to you guys. I think that a lot of the times we go through a lot of things that we just keep to ourselves because it seems that nobody cares, or it seems that it's not bad enough. And I care, for one. But trauma is still trauma no matter how small, and you have still gone through it. You have overcome it, or you were trying to overcome it. And I would love to be able to share that story if you are ready to share it. I can keep your name anonymous if you would like. I will not share any email addresses. So yeah, if you are ready to tell someone your story or just to have your voice heard, I can do so and just compile a whole bunch of your stories into videos to just share, to amplify your voices, to let you finally be heard. So if you would like to tell me your story, you can email me at dearbrookisurvived@gmail.com, and I would love to hear it. Let's get back to the story. So it was 1966 in Texas, and Edna Louise Sullivan was a 16-year-old living in Everman. Now, she was dating a 17-year-old in another town named Robert Brand, but Edna had been born on July 23rd of 1950 to Louis and Edna Ruth. Now, Edna Louise had grown up to be this beautiful, blue-eyed, brown-haired sophomore at the Everman High School. She was said to be very popular by her classmates and very well liked. And when she wasn't at school or with her family, she would volunteer at the church daycare center. That's where she loved to spend a lot of her time, according to her family. But if she wasn't doing that, she was hanging out with her boyfriend, Robert. He would often come down. He had a car, so he would come down and hang out with her all the time. Now, like I said, Robert Hugh Brand was 17 years old. He was born on June 26th of 1949 to Jack and Mary. He loved playing his guitar. That was one thing that I found that really stuck out about him from his family, was that he adored guitar, and that's something that he did often. But at this time, Robert's cousin Marcus was actually visiting Robert and staying at his home. His real name was Johnny Marcus Dunham, but he liked to go by his middle name, Marcus. And Marcus was born on July 1st of 1951 to Jack and Beatrice. And his family said he loved playing the drums. So of course, the cousins, Robert and Marcus, loved playing music together, and that's just one of the things that they did while hanging out. They didn't always see each other because they didn't live close, but when they were together, they got along. And so during this time, Robert was bringing Marcus everywhere he went. But Robert actually lived in Alvarado, Texas, which was 24 minutes from Everman. And like I said, Robert would take his 1955 Ford and come to see his girlfriend. And so this is what would occur on August 6th, and at 10 a.m. these three teens were kind of just sitting in the car, hanging out. They had just gotten done with a movie at the Southside Drive-In Theater. However, none would return home that night. Robert, who was driving, never dropped Edna off back home, and he nor Marcus returned back to their home, and the car was missing as well. But the search for Edna actually began first. It was quite early the next morning when her parents did notice that she was not home and immediately reported her missing. And because it was in the area where Edna lived rather than where Robert or Marcus lived, she was the one they were focusing on finding first because they wondered if something happened to her and if the two boys had already left. But it wouldn't be a police officer or part of the search team even that would begin to find bodies, because a fisherman, a local fisherman, would inform police that he had gone down to the water to start to fish, but he then noticed up by a fence area this car with the trunk wide open that was not occupied. Well, he didn't go close enough to look actually inside, but from where he could see, there was no driver, there was nobody sitting in there. It just looked abandoned. When this was located, they immediately walked up to the car and found two bodies inside of the trunk. This was Robert and Marcus. They had bullet-riddled bodies, and their autopsies would confirm that they were shot to death, in the head especially, but they were crammed into this tiny trunk at the time. Edna was not anywhere in this car or nearby. However, her name was written on the car's window with some sort of makeup. It appeared to be either a lipstick or a mascara, and her shoes and purse were still inside. She was at one point in that car. By then, the murders of these two boys were actually announced over the radio at this time to let everybody know that this was a horrific situation and that they needed to find Edna fast. They already knew that there was a killer among their community. However, there was no fingerprints found on the car and no evidence found on the bodies. However, in some sort of miracle, it would only take until the next day to have the killer in custody, or at least one of them. You see, a man came down to the Falls County Sheriff's Department and turned himself in. He began to mumble to himself, saying, "My God, I've got to tell somebody about it. I can't sleep, I can't think, I can't do nothing. I don't think people will ever understand. You've got to understand the circumstances, but I don't think anybody ever will." Now, this man was an 18-year-old named Roy Dale Green, who claimed that 3 teenagers were parked near a baseball field when he drove up next to them and, saw them sitting there. But Roy claimed that he wasn't alone. He wasn't actually the driver. He said he was actually on a trip with a friend after work because this was a coworker of his, so they decided to drive a bit. And this was a 20-year-old named Kenneth McDuff. They had been working all that day, and they decided to drive to Fort Worth while drinking some beer and hanging out together. But when they found these teens, they ended up stopping, and Kenneth got out of the car with his gun, walked up to their car, and demanded them to get out. When they did, he demanded that they all get into this trunk, all 3 of these teens. They did as they were told, and they were all so young, so small, that they fit into this trunk together. That really shows you how just young their lives were, how innocent they were. And they then drove to a different location with Kenneth driving their car, their Ford, and Roy driving their Dodge Coronet. According to Roy, they then drove to a very remote area, and Kenneth pulled Edna out of the trunk and left the other 2 inside. Now, there is some differences in different statements that I found. Some say that the 2 boys were actually pulled out of the car, shot to death, and placed back in. Others say that they were shot to death inside the trunk, but either way, they were begging for their lives, begging these men not to kill them, and that is exactly what they would do. Edna sat there and watched before being shoved back into their Dodge Coronet trunk and driving to a different location. Before they did that, though, Roy said that he did get the fingerprints off the car. He actually scrubbed the car down, and then when they took Edna to a different location, she was the only survivor, and she was forced to endure sexual assault by these men. It was said that it was 3 times by Kenneth. Then Kenneth demanded Roy to do so, and he did. And then Edna was dressed, and she too was killed. But this time, she wasn't just shot. This time, Kenneth was said to ask Roy to get him something that he could strangle her with. So Roy gave Kenneth his belt, and Kenneth ended up not taking it, but grabbing inside of his car where he had a broken broomstick It was just basically the handle of it. And he began pressing this against her windpipe until it snapped. And during this time, Edna was fighting. She was a true survivor trying to survive. And she couldn't. With these two men, Kenneth told Roy, grab her legs, hold her down. And she was killed. Roy was then told to dump her body in the bushes. He kind of threw it over a fence. And they got into the car and they left. Now, Roy was held at the police department during this time after this confession of triple homicide, but Sheriff Brady Pamplin found and arrested Kenneth, and this was not an easy feat because throughout this, shots were fired, a chase occurred. The sheriff actually had to shoot out Kenneth's tires to get him to stop in order to bring him down to the station for questioning. Roy was agreeing to testify against Kenneth for a lesser sentence because he said that Kenneth did all the killing, but he was there. The DA at the time, Doug Crouch, heard all of this, the confessions, and he decided that the death penalty was necessary after what they had done. You see, Roy had also given the motive, or what could be thought of as the only motive, and this was that Kenneth was looking for a girl that night to take home, or to take, because he had been on a sex rampage over the weekend. Now, Roy had said he had heard him talking about this, about taking women, and he really just thought it was all a joke. He didn't think that Kenneth was serious. He thought this was just kind of his personality, and he didn't realize the severity of the situation until the killings began. Now, this is just what Roy said. They were both held without bail, and while Kenneth was in custody, he refused to talk. He would not answer any of their questions. He just denied having any involvement and left it at that. However, Roy was still talking. He was giving them everything because he did not want to be in prison for the rest of his life. So further detail from him did reveal that when Kenneth was crushing Edna's windpipe, when she was killing her in such a brutal, horrific manner, unlike what you hear many people doing for a method of murder, he turned to Roy and he said, "This is how you kill a possum." He was comparing killing an animal, which is still horrific, to killing a 16-year-old girl. But then Roy began to tell what they did after they killed these 3 teens in cold blood. He said that they went to a nearby gas station and just bought some Coca-Cola. Then they went back to Roy's home to sleep. Now, the next day, they went to a friend's home while the search for Edna began. What Roy didn't know is that Kenneth had actually buried the gun on Roy's property right next to his garage. This friend that they had gone to was named Richard Boyd, and they went there to wash out Kenneth's car, I guess from the DNA, the crime scene. I don't know if there was any blood, but they wiped it of evidence, basically. However, Roy claimed that this entire time, what they had done was eating him alive. He could not stomach it anymore. He could not handle being the only one that knew. So that was actually the same day that he turned himself in. But before that, the only reason he really did was because he had confessed to Richard Boyd's mother. And they ended up telling his mother, who said, "Look, you need to turn yourself in. This is not okay." And that is why Roy ended up going into the police station himself, even implicating himself in the murders, even though he said that the actual murder wasn't done by him. Roy was saying that he kept seeing the murders and kept hearing the boys moan while they were being killed. Now, Roy did agree to take investigators to the location where he dumped Edna's body because they were still unable to locate her. However, twice he led them to an area and she could not be found there. And he kept saying, "I know she's here somewhere." He appeared to be very confused, like he wasn't misleading them. He just wasn't quite sure where it was. But finally, with a map drawn by Roy and a 200-person search party made up of police and volunteers, they did find her body. It was 2 days since the teens had vanished, and her body was in the bushes, face down beneath an oak tree. This was actually only 2 miles from Interstate 25, and remember that highway for later. But her autopsy did reveal that she was asphyxiated as well as sexually assaulted. 2 of her uncles identified the body for her parents, and a friend of Edna's actually came forward to say that she could have been a victim as well that night. This was Rhonda, and she had been invited to go with the 3 teens to the movies that night, kind of like a double date, I guess you could say. And she didn't go because she wasn't feeling well, but Edna was actually supposed to spend the night at her house that night to hang out a little bit and to get some time together, even though she couldn't go out to the movies. And she did not know that she would lose her friend and also be so close to death that night. And she was said to have a bit of survivor's guilt as well. Now, Roy was being charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of rape, and Kenneth was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape. But Roy said that he was scared, that he didn't want to do any of this, and Kenneth still said that he knew nothing about the case, and he began even talking about another killer in the area, not really blaming these murders on him, but more just speaking as though he was enthralled by this other killer. This was a man named Charles Whitman, and he was known as the Texas Tower Sniper. He had killed his mother and his wife before taking guns and going to the University of Texas, killing 16 people and injuring another 31. This was 5 days before Kenneth McDuff killed these 3 teens. Kenneth was then saying that Charles must have been crazy. During this time, Kenneth was actually being called the Broomstick Killer by the media. But who were these men? Well, Roy was said to be a high school dropout who actually worked for Kenneth's father, and we will get into what he does in a minute. But Roy was said to be a more submissive, timid person, and this is why his friendship with Kenneth worked, because he was this shy follower who would do what he was told, and Kenneth wanted someone like that, as his dominant, manipulative personality would fit better with someone who would just follow along. That is all that's really known about Roy. He wasn't said to get into too much trouble as a kid or in really his adult years, but he didn't stop Kenneth from doing these horrific things right in front of him. But Kenneth was born on March 21st of 1946, and he was a 5th child, but there would actually be 1 more after him, so he had 5 siblings in total. And his mother, Addie, stayed at home while his father ran a concrete business that was actually quite successful. It was said to be a construction boom during this time, and so everybody was really hiring his father, and they were quite wealthy. As one of the babies, Kenneth was adored. These kids had whatever they wanted. They were so loved. They were said to be really quite spoiled, and nobody would tell them no. When he was 8 years old, his mother opened a laundromat, and he was there a lot because his mother was, but he was said to actually start stealing from a woman at 8 years old. He then began getting in trouble at school for laughing during very inappropriate times, stealing baseball gloves, getting into fights, as well as being great at lying and being a bully to the younger people who were much smaller than him. But after a fight that he picked with this boy who ended up being stronger than him and beating him up, he dropped out of school in the 9th grade, and he moved in with his brother Lonnie, who was his older brother. Now, this brother Lonnie had also had problems in school when he was younger and was actually kicked off the school bus at one point. Now, when this happened, his mother Addie threatened the school bus driver with her gun, and she began to be called the pistol-packing mama because she would not allow her sons to be disciplined by anybody, and she thought they were always in the right. They were her babies, so she stood up for them, no matter how wrong they were. The next year, Kenneth was said to start drinking very heavily. However, he moved home, and his parents were more than accepting of him. They ended up buying him a brand new car. They got him a job with his father. He then bought a motorcycle from the money that he was making. And he was living the good life. He did not have any responsibilities, and his parents allowed him to walk all over them. But when he was 18, he was caught by the law, and his mother couldn't protect him anymore. You see, he was convicted of 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary. This was for many different things, and he had stolen $500 from one store, bullet and ice cream from another, and many more small robberies that all collectively did add up. And when he was caught, he told officers that this was really just a prank that he was doing. But he was sentenced to 12 four-year prison terms, which would have meant concurrently for 48 years. However, he would be paroled the next year, and this was due to the overcrowding in the Texas prison systems, which allowed for many violent offenders with long-term sentences to be released. Now, at this point, Kenneth had not done anything too violent. He really was one of them that they figured, we can let him go. It'll be fine. However, they were worried about him enough to sentence him to 48 years. And they did have the right to be worried because a year later, he would kill 3 innocent teenagers. Right before the murders, he did go back to prison for only a little bit for a fight. But he again was released, and this would not be the last time he would be released either. The trials were said to go quite quickly, and Roy did testify against Kenneth, who was pleading not guilty. Roy testified for 5 hours, and it was almost in a whisper. Many said that he was scared to death of Kenneth, but Roy gave that same statement and also added that he only raped Edna because he was scared that Kenneth would kill him if he didn't. Kenneth, though, then took the stand, and he said that Roy must have taken his car, done the killings, and tried to frame him. Now, one of the victims, Robert, his mother said that during the whole testimony that Kenneth's eyes were cold. But Kenneth's mother, Addie, well, she said that Kenneth had an alibi, that he was with a young woman from church that night, but didn't want to say her name and ruin her reputation. So instead of saying the name, he would rather go to prison. His mother said that he was too good for his own good. But Kenneth was sentenced to death 3 times. Roy was then sentenced to 25 years for his part. However, Roy had claimed that Kenneth had also bragged to him about sexually assaulting and killing other women. This was actually before his first prison sentence for the burglaries. So when he was only 17 years old, he said that he raped a woman, he cut her throat, and left her for dead in a ditch. He said that he had many women buried in shallow graves and that killing a woman was like a chicken because they both squawk. But did Kenneth McDuff really have more victims, or was he just trying to make himself seem bigger and scarier? If he did, how many more people had he killed, and were they just sitting there unsolved cases, or do we not even know about them at all? But the only bright side to this was that Kenneth was going to be locked away for a very long time, which meant that while he was locked up, they could figure out his real victim count and hopefully get him to tell them more. Or so they thought. The unraveling of the justice system began when Kenneth's death sentence was commuted to life in 1972, and years later, he would get a visitor. And this is when they still believed that he was going to be in prison for life. And this was a young woman. Kenneth had no idea who she was. And she went up to him, this killer, and told him, "I'm your daughter." He said this is impossible, so he was adamantly denying this. And that's when she said, "I am your daughter. That woman that you raped and tried to kill many years ago, she survived. You left her for dead, but she didn't die. She survived and had a daughter, his daughter." This was almost confirmation that Kenneth did kill more, probably way more than they could ever imagine. But this meeting with his daughter ended with Kenneth asking her to smuggle him drugs, basically, but that when he got out, he would take her to Las Vegas and he would be her pimp there. Needless to say, I'm sure this is not how the meeting was meant to go in his daughter's mind, but I'm not sure she visited again, because in 1989, after 23 years in prison, this time he was paroled at 43 years old. only 10 years after Roy was, who got a much lesser sentence. Now, this release was because of a new lawyer who thought that Roy was the real killer. He came up with all of this evidence and brought it to a parole board who believed that this was possibly the case and that Kenneth could still contribute to society. Oh, how wrong they were, but this was even after Kenneth was trying to bribe one of the parole board members for $10,000. He got more added on to his sentence at that point, but then they just released him anyway. He wasn't the only killer released during this time though, because due to that same overcrowding that had released him before, 20 on death row and 127 murderers were all free to roam, and that was just a few of the 40,000 inmates that were literally put back on the street with no rehabilitation. There was nothing to say that anything would change. It was just the fact that there was not a bed for them, so they were plopped out back on the street. The DA was telling this parole board he was an extraordinarily violent criminal, and they didn't care. They still released him. During this time, his brother Lonnie actually was killed in a fight over a woman. So Kenneth McDuff was being released, and he was basically the boogeyman to these towns in Texas where he had done the killings. He was the Michael Myers that the entire town feared was coming back for them to kill them all. Now, the son of Sheriff Pamplin, who actually became a sheriff himself, said, "I don't know if it'll be next week or next month or next year, but one of these days, dead girls are going to start turning up, and when that happens, the man you need to look for is Kenneth McDuff." After release, Kenneth did go back to those same exact small towns that he was in before for quite a while, but he then went to Waco, which is still not too far away, about an hour and a half from Everman. And he got a job at a local gas station. 3 days later, though, a body was found nearby. This was 35 minutes from Waco in Temple, Texas. And a 31-year-old sex worker named Seraphia Parker was found naked in a field off of Interstate 35, the same interstate where Edna was found. She had been beaten and strangled. Now, Temple was also a place where Kenneth would go to meet his parole officer, where he had to go and was there often. Many believed that Kenneth had killed again only 3 days after release. However, there was no evidence to connect him. There was no witness to rat him out this time, and her case went cold, and he continued to be free. Yet 9 months after he had been released, he was back in prison. But this wasn't for any sort of murder. This was actually because Kenneth was making death threats to African-American youths, using slurs and pulling out a knife, threatening to kill them, all while on parole, which made this even worse as an offense in the criminal justice system because he was on parole. And so he could have gotten a very big sentence. He could have been kept in prison forever for this, basically. However, 5 months later, his mother paid 2 lawyers to evaluate her son's release, and he was out once again. But not much was heard from Kenneth for these years. Not many were keeping tabs on him, really. And it was said that he was heavily drinking at some points. He had started using crack cocaine. He also enrolled at the Texas Technical College and continued the schooling that he did while in prison during this point, which meant he was around kids a lot younger than him and had a dorm room there. Although people weren't really watching him, nobody was making sure that he was doing what he was supposed to do and not killing again, it would not be the end of his rampage. There would just be many unsolved cases that he would leave behind. The bodies were not found until much later, some not until he told them where they were. But on September 27th of 1991, 23-year-old Cynthia Renee Gonzalez was found in a creek bed after disappearing from Arlington. This was about 2 hours from Waco, and many believed that Kenneth had something to do with this. It was completely unsolved. Less than a month after that, on October 10th of 1991 in Waco, where Kenneth was said to be living, Kenneth had stopped at a police checkpoint. It was just a routine checkpoint. And a woman next to him in his car began screaming and trying to kick out the window. At this point, officers were approaching, trying to see what was going on, trying to help this woman. and he ended up speeding off and running over 3 officers. After a quick chase, they did end up losing him, and the woman next to him was believed to be a missing woman named Brenda Thompson. However, the police did not look into this. They did not look into Kenneth, his car, this missing woman, connections to the two of them, or do any further investigating. But after this, Brenda was never seen again. Another woman vanished that same year. This was 17-year-old Regina Deanne Moore, who was also in Waco. She was a sex worker who had been seen arguing with Kenneth in a local hotel on October 15th of 1991, meaning only 5 days after Brenda was seen at that checkpoint and was thought to be killed. This is not where the bodies stop, unfortunately, because 3 months later, on December 29th of 1991, 28-year-old Colleen Reed was kidnapped in front of witnesses at an Austin car wash. They heard her screams, they came running, and only found her car sitting there covered in suds as though she was in the middle of washing it. It was at night. She was this very loved accountant who was targeted that night. It appeared as though somebody had come, picked her out, and kidnapped her. At this point, her body did not show up. She was just a missing woman, and 2 months after this, on February 24th of 1992, Valencia Joshua was a woman studying at the Texas State Technical Institute and was last seen knocking on a dorm room. That dorm room belonged to Kenneth McDuff. The next month, she was actually found strangled near a golf course in the brush. Now, with all of these witnesses, some even saying that they had seen a man that looked like Kenneth, nobody connected them to Kenneth, and they didn't even have a good idea of where he stayed, what he did, and who he was. The local police didn't really know who he was at all, what he had done in the past. Now, 2 months after that, on April 26th of 1992, the body of 22-year-old Melissa Northrup was found on Interstate 35. She had been strangled with a rope with her hands tied behind her back. Now, she had actually disappeared a month prior at the Waco Quick Pack, a gas station that Kenneth worked at. She was a mother of 2 and was actually pregnant when she had vanished. She was afraid of working at this gas station alone, especially at night. She would often tell her boyfriend or her husband that she did not like doing it, but it's what had to be done. When it was found that she had disappeared or had been kidnapped, $250 was missing from the cash register. So at first they thought maybe this was a robbery gone wrong, but it was found quickly that Kenneth's car was located about a block away, abandoned, and Melissa's car was gone from her spot at the gas station. A friend of Kenneth's also would come forward saying that Kenneth had been talking about wanting to rob that very gas station and even asked them if they wanted to join. However, as investigators from all of these different places in Texas were finally putting it together, not only was this man a monster, he had possibly been continuing killing this whole time, and we just didn't know because all of the murders were spread out and nobody was really aware and keeping tabs on Kenneth. As they were figuring all this out, things were starting to go in a good direction. As far as getting him locked up again, he himself vanished. They had no idea that he had gotten a fake ID, that he had moved states, and all they knew at this point was that they had heard that he had started selling drugs and had an illegal firearm, which were both federal offenses, meaning the entire investigation was just taken to another level, and they could possibly find him through, getting him a wanted poster and actually going after him for this rather than any murder, which seems so backwards, but this is just how it was because the federal offense could get him to be arrested quickly. Investigators then found one of Kenneth's new friends, who was a 34-year-old named Alva Hank Worley, and they brought him in for questioning. They noticed that he appeared not to have many emotions, but he was very nervous sometimes when talking about Kenneth. He then said that he believed that Kenneth might have hurt somebody. And that's when he started talking. He said that Kenneth would often drive along the streets and point out women that he wanted to take. And Alva then confessed that he was a part of the last 2 kidnappings of Colleen Reed and Melissa Northrup. That with Colleen, Kenneth actually grabbed her and kidnapped her, and they both raped her and burnt cigarettes on her, and she was tortured. and Alva said that her screams were so loud it hurt his ears, but after the murder, he was dropped off and didn't know where her body was dumped. He said that with Melissa, Kenneth had an obsession with her and actually wanted to just rob the store, but then also take her. He talked about her all the time, and Alva claimed that he was never a part of the actual murders, just, the kidnappings and watching it occur. He was held in jail while the search for Kenneth continued, and this was just such a parallel to the Broomstick murders of those 3 teens with Roy Dale Green. These were 5 more murders that could possibly be connected to Kenneth. At this point, they knew they needed to do more, so Kenneth was actually placed on America's Most Wanted, and investigators then went to Kenneth's parents' home to look for him, first of all, because they wondered if he hid out there, because a lot of criminals, while they're on the run, they do go back to where they're comfortable, which would be their hometown, especially with their parents. But after a search, he was not found there, and they actually began talking to his parents. And his father said, look, if you find him, you can kill him if you want. Everyone around Kenneth throughout his life was interviewed, and they were all saying that he was constantly talking about murder, about burying people. And at this point, officers weren't actually going home. They were working 24/7 to find Kenneth. They were sleeping in the police department. They were not seeing their families. They were barely getting any sleep at all. And they were determined to find him before he continued killing or disappeared completely. And they got a huge break the next day when a man called in from America's Most Wanted. And he said that his coworker looked quite similar to Kenneth. Though his name was not Kenneth McDuff, it was actually Richard Fowler. This was all the way in Kansas City, Missouri, where this man was working as a trash collector. So the Kansas City Police Department got this call first, and they looked up Richard Fowler in their system. And they found that he already had a criminal record there in Kansas City, Missouri, because he was basically fingerprinted for soliciting sex workers. So they called the Texas investigators, and they compared the fingerprints from Richard Fowler to Kenneth McDuff, and sure enough, it was him. So on May 4th of 1992, 6 officers watched as Kenneth took his route to pick up the trash, and then they arrested him at the landfill. 3 of these officers who arrested him this time actually had fathers who had arrested Kenneth McDuff the first time, hoping that they would never have to again, and now their sons had to do it. This was the 2nd time that Kenneth had been released from prison, only to go on to kill. He was brought back to Waco, where he was charged with the murders of Colleen Reed and Melissa Northrup, because those are the ones that basically Alva said that he was connected to. There was a witness there, and the ones most recent that they felt like they could have a better chance at convicting him for. The first trial was actually for Melissa. Kenneth tried to represent himself at, and his mother Addie did take the stand, where she said that he did use her credit card in Waco when Melissa was murdered, placing him in that area. 2 friends then testified against Kenneth, saying that he had asked them to rob this store, and Kenneth began getting very angry. He threw a pencil across the room and was complaining to reporters that his lawyers weren't listening to him or helping him. Alva did testify against him as well, and he said that he was terrified of him. He didn't want to do this, but he knew that he had to. And Kenneth then demanded to testify for himself, just like in the trial for the Broomstick murders. And his lawyer said this is not a good idea, but he did so anyways. He talked for 2 hours about how he got to Kansas, why he was in Kansas, or I guess Kansas City, Missouri, and really nothing about the murders. He pled not guilty, but was found guilty and was sentenced to death once again. The same occurred with the murder of Colleen, even without having her body. As he left the courtroom, he began saying, "I'm sorry about what happened, but I'm not the one who did it." He was then fighting the officers who were trying to lead him out of the room. In his life, he had been sentenced to death 5 times, 3 for the teens and 2 for Melissa and Colleen. But it was a fear for many that he would be released just like before. A journalist even said during this time that if anybody was a good argument for the death penalty, it was Kenneth McDuff. Now, the sheriff, Larry Pamplin, said that this man had absolutely no conscience and that he enjoys the killing.
McDuff was still denying involvement in any murder.
Tell them where Colleen Reed is. They still haven't found her body. is there any way to make amends?
First of all, I would have to know where it was at.
Did you ever kill anybody?
No.
Not even those kids back in 1966?
No. I don't want to see anyone suffer or die. There's so many rights and wrongs, in the world that, it's whose point of view what is right and what's wrong.
Some would say you're the poster child for what is wrong.
And you sure talking to me bad.
Now, the execution was scheduled for November 18th, 1998, and a few weeks prior, Kenneth actually confessed where Regina's body was, but not to investigators or reporters. This was actually to an inmate turned informant. You see, Regina Moore's body was found near a creek, and she was tied up with stockings and shoelaces, and she had been sexually assaulted. This inmate informant said that Kenneth had finally told him where her body was, and that is how they found Regina. But then Kenneth actually confessed to investigators where her body was, and he was even brought to the scene to point it out. This was the body of Colleen. Colleen was located near a river where Kenneth had grown up. Now, she was found to have been tortured with cigarettes and sexually assaulted. And then he actually confessed to where Brenda Thompson was, the woman seen by police at the checkpoint trying to escape. Brenda was found buried near U.S. Route 85 in a wooded area, and she too had been tortured to death. She also almost survived that night. Now, Kenneth's last meal request was said to be a steak. However, they made the steak out of hamburger at the jail, and his last words were, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." It was said that this was the only time that he ever showed emotions. However, these emotions were not remorse. And once he was dead, Melissa's mother, the victim's mother, said that she felt wonderful, that she knows where he was released to. She said that the hardest thing that she ever had to do was tell Melissa's kids that she was never coming home.
To the very end, he considered himself the victim.
He didn't die a horrible death, no way. He died an easy death.
His death was nothing compared to the death that he put all these women through, including my daughter. They died horrific deaths. All he did was go to sleep.
Now, his family did not claim his remains, and he is buried at the Prisoners' Cemetery of Captain Joubert Cemetery. And psychologist Fred Labowitz told a reporter after he had spoken to Kenneth, "He has no soul. This guy goes beyond the study of human behavior. In some people, we can find behavior antecedents in childhood, an absent father, a drunken mother, an abusive home, but it appears there was none of these. It seems his incredible lust for evil appeared spontaneously and full blown." Now, although he was sentenced for these 2 women, investigators believe that he killed many more, and actually more than what I even told you. They believed it was between 9 and 14 women after the murders of the 3 teens. Investigators started searching through missing persons cases in these areas for John and Jane Doe's, anything that they could connect to Kenneth. However, they were very aware that they didn't want to go too crazy due to the chaos of another serial killer that had faked confessions to many. You see, this was Henry Lee Lewis, who was known as the Confession Killer because he was known to kill his mother and 2 others. But then he went on to confess to 600, even up in the thousands at some points in Texas, that he killed all of these people and that he was one of the most prolific serial killers ever. However, after much investigation and time into these, they were believed to be false confessions. So they knew they didn't want this to turn out like a Henry Lee Lucas kind of thing, especially because it does give the killers this feeling of being more infamous, more prolific. However, if they were connected, then they wanted to figure out where these bodies were or who these people were, and they wanted to see if they could find these people justice. However, I could not find that they have connected anybody else and actual names of people, so we just may never know. But due to Kenneth McDuff, they actually did implement the McDuff laws in Texas. These aren't officially called them, but it is mainly due to what happened with Kenneth and the fact that he was paroled so many times when he shouldn't have been. This law actually strengthened parole laws and made it more difficult for violent criminals to be paroled, and if they were, for better monitoring to occur of them, because like I said, Kenneth was not watched at all. They basically forgot about him and just let him do whatever he wanted, which was killing more people. A 40-year minimum for capital murder was also imposed, and around this time that the McDuff laws went into effect, it was said that crime did go down because of this. But what happened to the first accomplice that was released? Well, Roy was actually committed to a psych ward at a state hospital a year after being released for threatening to kill his mother. There was nothing else that is known about his life, whether he's alive or dead today. I could literally not find anything. So if you can find something, please let us know down below. But the last I heard, he was in the psych ward for trying to kill his own mom. Now, Kenneth's second accomplice, the Alva Hank Worley, did face aggravated kidnapping charges at one point. However, I was unable to find any sort of trial for him or if he was ever sentenced or where he is today. Again, if you know, let me know. I do want to say that even though Texas did implement more laws that would help this, it is a problem in our criminal justice system overall. I think it's a lot harder than we think to rehabilitate criminals. Not that it can't be done, but when you have someone who is manipulative, conniving, can sometimes be charming, how do you make sure that they are not manipulating their way out of the system by saying or acting as though they are rehabilitated? I think that is a huge problem, that there is not a lot of effort in looking into these criminals who are about to be released psychologically and making that a huge part of it as well. And we see too many times that these people will do horrific things, will be locked up, and their victims or their survivors get justice, but then they are released because people say, oh, they've been in there long enough, they deserve to be free because they are a rehabilitated new person who has found Jesus inside of prison. And then they go on to do that same exact thing again. Again, not saying that you cannot be rehabilitated. Some people really do change their life around, but some people will never change. And that is so scary that it can be so easy for them to just be free. And especially back then, I cannot imagine the amount of people who lived in fear because they were literally just cranking out the inmates out of their cells. Like, I'm not even looking at your case. I'm not looking at who you are. Go. We don't have a bed for you. I can't imagine how horrific that was and how much crime was actually occurring during that time. And I'd like to know, if you live in Texas, do you see this being any better? I feel very angry for the victims that this occurred to, where they got justice, and even if maybe their family was excited about this, that they felt finally they had peace, that was ripped away the moment that door opened for their killer or their monster, and nobody cared, it seemed, that these people had done these horrific things and that they had no punishment for it. How young do you think that Kenneth McDuff killed? It really appears to me that his behavior started very young, and there's a good chance that his kills did as well. I mean, we know that as young as 17, he had murdered someone and left them for dead. And thankfully, he wasn't obviously as experienced, which I hate to use that word, but this woman did end up surviving. I do think it's sort of interesting talking about serial killers who don't have that background of a horrible childhood, an abusive environment, because it really does go to show that evil can just be inside your body from the time you're born and can slowly start revealing itself. It's something that a lot of people fight over, nature versus nurture. And I think that there is both. I think that there is room for both. And I think we need to be more aware of the ones who are just born evil, because those are the ones you can't predict. Those are the ones who don't have a background in, oh, this is why that happened to you. Maybe we can work that out and make you better. Well, if there's nothing that made them that way, how do we make them better? It's a question we really have to ask ourselves. Is there a way to rehabilitate people who have literally always been that way? So I hope that this brought some victims to the forefront that you were unaware of, and that we really start discussing the criminal justice system in the way of parole, in the way of release, and rehabilitation needs to be something that we put a lot of effort into, that we make sure that it has been done if we're going to say it has. So yeah, happy Halloween. I love you so much. Remember, if you would like to send me a survivor story or just something that you've been through, then email me at dearbrookeIsurvived@gmail.com, and I would love to hear it. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay. Also, I have merch with that saying. If you'd like to get it, 100% of the proceeds will be going to a kidnapping survivor who is putting self-care bags for survivors together to help other survivors heal. Okay, bye.